Hey everyone. Well, thanks so much for coming, and it's a great turnout. So thanks so much for being here. Basically, how this panel is going to go is I'm going to introduce the two authors, and we'll run through some questions that I've pre-prepared that they've had the time to think about, and then I hope that there's enough time at the end we could open it up to the audience. I'm sure all of you will have some lovely additions to the panel. So to begin that, to introduce each author, Teow is the author of two poetry collections, Islanders 2016 and Faraway Places 2021, and the essay collection Western Journeys, which she just let us know the only place it's in print in the entire world is right here at the Missoula Library. 4 copies are remaining if you want to buy one. Her essays, poetry, and criticism have been or will be featured in the Georgia Review, the Beloit Poetry Journal, the Los Angeles Review of Books, PBS NewsHour, and The New Yorker. Mark Johnson is a professor with the University of Notre Dame, partnering with teachers who work in Catholic schools across the nation. His research interests focus on the history of Chinese communities in Montana, detailed in his book, The Middle Kingdom Under the Big Sky, A History of the Chinese Experience in Montana, published in 2022. Born and raised in Great Falls, he now lives in Helena. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought to begin, I thought we could ask Mark, as the historian on this panel, to give us sort of this brief 30,000-foot view of the timeline of Chinese presence in Montana so we could all get situated. And if you want some extra credit here, maybe you could throw some stuff in for Missoula specifically as well, and I could help you in to fill in some of that history. But yeah, Mark.
Thank you, Paul. I'm just delighted to have such a good turnout on a beautiful day. I know there's many things you could be doing outside in this wonderful Big Sky state. The history of the Chinese experience in Montana, as you know, there were Chinese here working in gold mines, working in railroads, as early as the early 1860s. So when gold was discovered, Alder Creek, Grasshopper Creek, Virginia City, the world came to Montana. Clearly, there were worlds here in Montana before European settlers, before Chinese settlers. But in terms of the non-native population of Montana, really 1862, 63, the Chinese are coming here to try and mine for gold. Placer mining, sluice box, panning. Those Chinese had come probably to California earlier in 1848, 1849. Idaho, Colorado, anywhere that there were precious metal strikes, the Chinese were coming across the Pacific to try and get rich on what they called Gold Mountain. The Chinese who were coming here to Montana and the American West came from a very specific part of southern China, Guangdong province, but even more specifically than that, this county called Taishan County. Anytime you're looking at immigration, there's going to be push factors and pull factors. The pull was trying to earn money here in America, in the western North American placer fields. The push were difficult conditions down in southern China. War, famine, flood, disasters, making life very, very difficult. So the money earned here was life-sustaining for family members back in southern China. But when they get here to Montana, things are difficult, just like they'd been in California. So there were very quickly laws put up against them earning money in the gold fields. 1872, there was a Montana territorial statute that said that the Chinese couldn't own their own placer mining claims. It was enforced spottily, but the idea is that continually lucrative professions were systematically taken away from Chinese earners. Yes, they did mine gold, and then they were kind of pushed out of that. Yes, they did build a railroad in the 1880s and 1890s. When those were done, though, the professions that were left open to Chinese Montanans generally were filled with laundry work, restaurant work, gardening, some merchants, and merchants had a different status than those other laborers that I just mentioned, laundry, restaurant, day laborers, gardeners, because there was something passed called the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which tried to stop Chinese laborers from coming in to compete against American workers, or so-called American workers. It didn't stop Chinese merchants or doctors or scholars from coming in. It was very specifically pointed against laborers to try and stop that competition. It was reasserted in 1892, reasserted in 1902. Chinese Exclusion Act didn't end until 1943. All right. Why would it end in 1943? Well, wartime partnership with a common enemy. America was fighting against Japan, China was fighting against Japan. It was unsightly to have a law saying we don't want your people to come into our nation, but we do want your help in this war against the common enemy. But even then, in 1943, the door wasn't flung wide open. 105 Chinese people per year were allowed in. I didn't say 105,000, 105. It was a nominal nod to politics at the time, but still the racism and the desire to not have these workers compete persisted. Okay. during that entire time period, up until 1943, for Chinese people of Chinese ethnicity in the United States, they could not become citizens. Most immigrants were allowed to go through the process of naturalization. Chinese people in America were not allowed to become naturalized citizens. The only way that they could become citizens, if you were of Chinese ethnicity, was to be born on American soil. That was made systematically difficult as well. We can talk about the reasons for that as we go along, but basically the gender discrepancy made family formation for Chinese families to become Chinese American families almost impossible. In 1900, there were 40 Chinese men for every one Chinese woman in Montana. Now you might say, well, do they have to marry a Chinese man, have to marry a Chinese woman? Yes. From 1909 to 1953, Chinese people were not allowed to marry outside of their race. Systematically made difficult for Chinese families to take root here and to gain citizenship. So times were definitely tough. Here in Missoula, there was a large Chinese community, maybe about 100 around the turn of the century. Sometimes you'll see a stat that in Missoula there was 405 Chinese people. That was Missoula County in 1890, right? But then a number of different counties were carved up from Missoula County, so that number sometimes is a little bit deceiving, but definitely a large Chinese community here in Missoula. There was an attempt to push them out as well. In 1891, there was an attempted boycott against Chinese businesses in Missoula. Thankfully, most of the attempted boycotts across Montana did not push the Chinese out of towns and villages in Montana. There's an attempt in Dillon and Deer Lodge and Butte and Helena, attempts at boycotts, and almost all of them failed. The only one that succeeded, tragically, was in Anaconda, where the Chinese were systematically pushed out. And sadly, my hometown of Great Falls, Montana, never allowed Chinese to settle, right, until 1938. And the first guy to settle there was an American Chinese man. It was so controversial that the city council of Great Falls had to have a meeting to figure out, should we let this guy settle and make a restaurant here? He's an American guy who happens to be of Chinese ethnicity. So these stories come pretty close to the present, but that's kind of the arc of the Chinese history in Montana. It peaked at 2,532 Chinese Montanans in 1890, declined precipitously down to just over 200 in 1950. There's a number of reasons why it declined so rapidly, but that's the basic overview.
Thanks, Mark. And looking forward to teasing out some of the things that you mentioned through the course of that. So that's a very helpful roadmap for where we're headed. Teow, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about your work a bit, especially your new essay collection, Western Journeys, and the context to which you approach writing about the Chinese experience across the West, but also your experience here.
So the way to give the overview of my work is I write from the nexus of people and place, and one of my major projects is to recover the stories of Chinese immigrants in the American West. So my first book, which is Islanders, which I do have my own copies if you want one. I use poetry to write into the history of Chinese exclusion and detention at the Angel Island Immigration Station in the San Francisco Bay. That was where most of the Chinese who came, is the port of entry. And because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, like you mentioned, they had to prove that they were not laborers or that they were immediate family. And it's a very onerous interview process. And during that time, they stayed on Angel Island. They wrote poems on the walls. None of the poems we have on record were found in the men's. None of the poems we have on record were written by the women, and that's because the women's barracks had burned down in a fire. So, in this book, I imagine what the women might have said. So that's my first project, and then I have poetry manuscripts in various stages of completion. One is on the 1885 massacre of Chinese miners in Rock Springs, Wyoming, as well as another one on a Chinese prostitute in Evanston, Wyoming, around the time of the Rock Springs Chinese massacre. So these are poetry projects rooted in archival research, but I also use imagination to fill the gaps of what we don't know. And my new book, which, like Paul said, is it's not out till October. So right now, that table outside there is the only place in the world you can get it. It's an essay collection that explores some of this same territory from a different angle. And I chronicle my experiences immigrating from Singapore and spending the last 15 years living in and exploring the American West, interrogating our ideas of place, history, memory, and what it means for an immigrant to be at home. And lately, I've been thinking about the larger Chinese diaspora, and one of the questions is, for its Chinese that is and still intact and powerful motherland, versus the many people over the last century who've had to immigrate due to war or poverty or and other kinds of desperation. But I have some ideas of how I'm going to do it, but it's a long way to go.
Thanks for that. So I wanted to ask the first real question of this panel, which is, in each of your works, a consistent theme is the effort to locate a sense of home for Chinese people who are living in the American West. And in Teow's case specifically, in Western Journeys, an attempt is made to chart the self as a subject. What does home mean for the people in your work, and how do they attempt to maintain relationships, both cultural and material, to the places that they came from? And I guess we could start with Mark here.
Yeah, so sometimes you'll hear that the Chinese in the West never intended to make this home. They just wanted to come here, get rich, and then go back to southern China. What we know from other studies at the same time period where the Chinese were going out from southern China to Malaysia, to Singapore, to Indonesia, places like that, they did tend to migrate in family units and make those newfound geographies home. Like I mentioned earlier, that was made systematically impossible here. So also sometimes you'll hear that the Chinese communities in Montana were bachelor societies, almost all male bachelor societies. They were married. More than 50% of Montana's Chinese men were married to whom? Wives back in southern China. So they're transnational, complicated families. One of the things that I think my book does that's new is to try and tease out those connections. So working at the Montana Historical Society over in Helena, I found 2 large collections of documents, all in Chinese. One collection was letters from the 1880s to 1920s from family members back in southern China to a gentleman working in Butte as a laundry worker. The next collection was a different time period and different issues, but high drama and tension in that one. But through a series of pretty complicated linguistic gymnastics, we had these letters translated, and they testify to that issue of home that Paul mentioned. So these guys working in Montana tried to make this home, but also had pressures from their original home. These letters continually, and they're featured in chapter 2, continually show the pressures that these gentlemen were under. Send more money, send more money, send more money, come home and get married, send more money. And the money wasn't frivolous. This was life-sustaining, like I mentioned. That county that I mentioned, Taishan County, as much as 80% of the income earned for Taishan County was earned abroad. And it was said that when the ships stop sailing, the fires don't burn. Like they can't cook rice if the money is not coming from abroad, coming from Butte, Missoula, Helena, places like that. So these letters testify to that difficulty and the pressures that this guy in Butte was under. And it's a microcosm. He's just one person, but we can expand that to assume the pressures that all of the Chinese working here in Montana were under from people back home and with the inability to make this truly home. One group was allowed to make this home, merchants who were allowed to bring in a wife and then begin to transition from Chinese families to Chinese American families. It was a very small number of those in Montana, though.
I have to ask, where do you find those letters?
It's a complicated story. So the letters were preserved in Butte at this place called the Meiwa Noodle Parlor, now the Meiwa Society. I highly recommend going there and stopping by the Pekin Cafe down the street, the longest continuously operating Chinese restaurant in America. It's a pretty cool claim that we have in Montana. But in the 1950s, as Butte's Chinese population shrank, when they left, they would leave things behind. And these tended to be pushed into the remaining buildings. And so the Meiwa Noodle Parlor had all these collections of overflowing boxes and things like that. And Butte was in tough times in the 1970s and 1980s, and so people worried that this building was leaking. There was a series of arsons in Butte at the time period. They worried about the preservation of these records. Nowhere in Butte could preserve them, and so they contracted with the Montana Historical Society that could preserve these letters. Montana Historical Society took these large collections, and basically they gathered dust. There was one attempt by a gentleman from the University of Montana who had the Chinese language abilities to try and translate these in 1988. He looked at 3 of the letters, concluded they deal with family issues, and they are of no historical import. He was right about the first part. My book argues that he was wrong about that second part.
I will say that this is the first time I've heard of anyone who's found any of these letters, because, you know, the story you always hear, and even by, you know, pretty prominent Chinese American history scholars, is that there were no records of these letters, but apparently they are in Montana. I mean, I'm pretty much cover the same territory as he does. So I agree with everything he said. You know, the one question that well, maybe I can find letters. Maybe I need to go around Montana to find letters. But, you know, the one question that I do wonder, and this is an open question that I have not figured out yet, is most of the Chinese the way immigration law worked was 1875 Page Act banned the entries of a Chinese women who were sex workers. And what that actually entailed is that every Chinese woman who wanted to immigrate to the U.S. had to basically prove her virtue to consular officers, which most respectable women didn't want to do. So most of the Chinese women in the U.S. were indeed sex workers. And they were victims of both American racism and Chinese patriarchy. I mean, they were, you know, American racism definitely shaped, like, the overall shape of their lives, but their immediate oppressors, you know, like the madams, you know, the kidnappers, they were all Chinese. So what they felt about all of this, anyone's guess, because they were essentially abandoned or abused, like, by their own people as well. You know, so what they thought of as home, who knows?
Thanks for that.
Oh, actually, can I add one more thing? And one of the surprising things I learned when I was researching the Rock Springs Chinese massacre. So Rock Springs, Wyoming is, you know, middle of nowhere. I'm sure most of you who live in Montana understand that. And one of the things I learned was that abalone was part of their diet. And just think about the relationships and the connection to the culture that it took for them to import abalone into the middle of Wyoming.
We're going to have to share a mic. Thanks for that. And I want to dive a bit more into, Mark, we were obviously talking about the preservation of those letters, and I want to talk a little bit more about the historiography. And Teow, when you mentioned that in Angel Island, we obviously lost a lot of the poems written on the walls due to arson, and it's hard to speculate that what these Chinese sex workers might have thought of the time. I want to talk a little bit more about that and the relationship between collective memory and how history has been written and remembered in this region. A good example I wanted to draw on to set the scene for this question here is, you know, you could think about the cowboy, for instance. Everyone here is very familiar with cowboys, I imagine. I imagine it's in no small part of the shared Montana heritage that we're all very proud of. But the cowboy is so... The cowboy is so embedded in the American mythology that it's hard to sometimes see the extent to which the cowboy is a product of nationalist discourses that are both gendered and racialized. In particular, I wanted to read, there's a frontier historian named Rick A. Smith, and he wrote of the cowboy as a cultural image that it was a potent antidote to waning Victorian manhood in an age of immigration and women's political action, an icon of ideal masculinity that asserted its naturalness by mapping itself onto the wilderness and as that which stood in opposition to the polluted masculinities of the urban and domestic spheres. So what I really want to draw out here is when they say polluted masculinities, they're not talking about just people, men on the East Coast of bourgeois backgrounds that they thought were Victorian and therefore effeminate. I really want to tease out how Chinese men were created as cultural objects during this period as well. Because you have Chinese men who are legally forbidden from being American. They take on domestic work, like that's considered effeminate, such as laundry and cooking and gardening, all the while being forbidden from marrying, from starting a family, from seeing their partners. So in the end, you could compare the opposite clean-cut masculine image of the cowboy, the white cowboy, the striking frontiersman, against the Chinese man who's culturally constructed as weak, effeminate, exotic, uncivilized, alien. And so the question I really want to ask here is, what does it mean to destabilize this racialized mythology? And how is history in the West written in such a way that categorically excludes non-white experiences?
I pretty much wrote a whole essay on this in Western journeys. Well, let me just quote myself. So I say that Hollywood situates the cowboy as the origin story of the American West, an emblem of stoic masculinity, of power derived from the ability to control one's emotions and environment. But he was also a mask for the real forces that shaped the West, the corporations and industrial robber barons. And he's a cloak for the ideology of dominance and white supremacy. Just for context, this is an essay on my adventures in writing about the Rock Springs Chinese massacre. It was a direct outcome of Manifest Destiny and the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific, which owned the coal mines in Rock Springs, they built the railroad through southwestern Wyoming because they wanted to access the coal deposits there. And I argue that this is precisely why the cowboy mythology is so potent, because it is less impolitic to idealize a charismatic and down-home hero. And to destabilize this racialized mythology is to bring these hidden assumptions into view, because it's only when you can name and describe something that you can begin to address its problems. And it also decenters the white experience in favor of a polyphony of voices and stories rooted in realities on the ground. And let me read one passage. So the Chinese were among the first people who were compelled to immigrate at the beginning of the industrial era, leaving impoverished towns and ruined crops to provide back-breaking labor in a foreign land, a prefiguration to today's global displacements. For the most part, they were not slaves, not in North America at least. Instead, they inhabited a liminal space with the illusion of choice, free to accept or break contracts, their lives still constrained by the circumstances of their race and origins. They were the antithesis of the cowboy, stereotyped as meek and subservient, unable to reinvent themselves, a visible representation of the underbelly of industrial capitalism that the nation would rather not acknowledge. Chinese exclusion may have been driven by tribalism and xenophobia, but it was also a backlash to the degradations of a newly mechanized world. And the Chinese Exclusion Act may have been repealed in 1943, but the forces that shaped that era are still with us. The stereotypes remain the same. Asians are obedient robots, and Asian women are submissive sirens, convenient specters to invoke in times of cataclysmic change, in times of anxiety about what the future might hold.
Thank you. That's tragically beautiful, right? And what you said, the stereotyped as meek and subservient. You're absolutely right. They were considered meek and subservient. Through my research, I found that they were not, and I'm sure that you agree. In Montana, they actively stood up against oppression. So sometimes you'll hear this, and I'm sure people have heard this. Throughout Montana, there's these supposed Chinese tunnels. And so I was talking to somebody at a talk I gave on Thursday night, and she said, I heard that the Chinese in Butte were treated so poorly that they couldn't even live above ground. No, that's not true. They lived above ground. They advocated for themselves. They stood up for their rights. They fought in courts. In Butte, at that time period where she was saying they couldn't even live above ground, there was a Chinese militia training in military tactics and practicing with live ammunition and rifles. That's not living below ground. That's empowered, that's strong, that's resilient. Now, that wasn't to try and protect themselves against white aggression here in Montana. You have to understand Chinese history and what was going on at that time period. They wanted to go back and retake China from the Dowager Empress and put the true emperor back on the throne. So it's Chinese history coming into contact with Montana current events. But they were not meek and subservient. They absolutely fought for their rights, their place in society, their individual goals, community goals, national goals. You did mention a convenient foil, and Paul, back to your question about kind of masculinity and feminized roles and things like that. Yeah, they did take on largely feminized roles, laundry work, restaurant work. The gender disparity that I mentioned wasn't just for Chinese communities. It was an overwhelmingly male population on the frontier of Montana. And so they filled the niches that were allowed to them. They hadn't really done laundry work or restaurant work necessarily back in southern China, but they did work that they were allowed to do. But that the feminized nature of things also was a double-edged sword. Oftentimes they were seen as predatory upon white women. So Thomas Dimsdale, the editor of Montana's first newspaper and Montana's first Secretary of Education, I believe, commenting on things that are happening in California where supposedly Chinese men are defiling white women, writes this: "They play sad havoc with the morals of the young females. The girls being in constant contact with the China boys, they become imprudent, and the girls were ruined. It is sickening to think of beautiful white girls being seduced by these copper-color young scoundrels," end quote. Not my words, end quote, right? He continues, though, and anybody with a little bit of knowledge on Montana history will know this illusion. Dimsdale in the mid-1860s writes, "Is there no hemp in California?" What's the illusion there? Lynching. Dimsdale is advocating a solution to the, quote, Chinese problem being at the end of a hangman's rope. Thankfully, in Montana, there were not large outbursts of bloodshed. The Rock Springs Massacre happened in September 1885. There were threats of similar things happening after that in Montana, and thankfully they did not. I don't want to pretend that the Chinese experience in Montana was free from violence, but thankfully it was free from the systematic mass murder and focused mass murder in 1885 in Rock Springs, or in 1887 along the Idaho-Oregon border, where more than 30 Chinese miners were killed, or in 1885 in Seattle with a mass expulsion, or Tacoma with a mass expulsion. Didn't happen here in Montana. There's a couple of complex reasons why that might be the case. But back to the feminized nature of things. When the boycotts against Montana's Chinese were attempted, they often were out of the claim that we need to protect white women's jobs. These Chinese laundry workers are taking jobs away from that white women could do. And so when the boycotts were instituted and the Chinese kind of lost a little bit of that niche, turns out nobody rose up to take those jobs. And so after a couple of months of the boycott, they're like, I guess we'll let the Chinese go back to that work, right? And so navigating the latitude to try and exist economically, culturally, and just physically here in Montana was never easy.
Thanks for that, Mark. I want to open up a space here for both of you to reflect and talk a bit about your methodological processes. For Mark, they'll be very different than Teow, but I want to hear a bit about how you pursued your work. What were some of the fundamental questions you were thinking about? What was your engagement with the archives, and what did you learn from that experience? So generally, I just want to hear about your actual working process.
Well, my process was 12 years, so I'll let you go first, because I don't know how long I could take on this.
15 years. So, like I said earlier, I work in two genres, essays and poetry. And in my essays, I tend to explore the dimensions of a subject using a variety of methods, which include archival research and travel adventures. But I tend to stick to the facts. And yes, there are gaps, but I think it's important to acknowledge the gaps. And in part because it makes us interrogate what we, and when I say we, I mean both as individuals and as a culture, choose to choose to preserve and remember. And there is power in saying that we don't know this and this is why. But in my poetry, I tend to imagine into the gaps. And so, for example, for the Angel Island work, there has been a lot of research done by historians that I could draw on. And I didn't really have to go into the archives because of that. For the Rock Springs work, because there's not a lot of existing work done, and one of the books that have been published, let me quote the guy, okay? Hang on. He says that the Rock Springs Massacre and the Chinese Exclusion Act have little to do with race prejudice or immigration policy. The issue, rather, was the status of the American working man in the industrial era. In other words, there are problems with the book. So I had to use the archives, but the archives were, if you think about, first of all, it's not just the white perspective, but it was the railroad managers and the territorial government. So there was certainly limitations to that too. So when I try to imagine into the gaps, I try to evoke the lived experience of this history based on what I know from the documents, but also what I know of Chinese culture. And I think of history as the accumulation of individual lives, and they're often driven by, the subterranean impulses of the spirit. And the social and political forces that shape the course of history have a direct impact on people's private lives. People who have dreams and fears and loves and regrets. A Chinese man with a wife back in China. What was that experience like? During a time when communication was difficult and expensive. And the other thing is that this is a story about, it is a social, political, historical story, but it's not an abstract game of, philosophy or rhetoric that a lot of these immigration conversations are these days. And it's not about winning an argument, it's about showing how it impacts, real human beings. And the way I see it too is that fiction is learning by imagination. It's not about making things up from whole cloth. It's still rooted in, I'm taking the facts of what we do know and to create plausible depictions of what the Chinese experience might have been.
That's wonderful. I like that you acknowledge those gaps and fill those gaps with your deep research and deep cultural knowledge. Before that, when there had been gaps in the Chinese experience in the American West, they're often filled with exoticization and mythology. And so we get a lot of titillating stories about those Chinese tunnels and opium dens everywhere and Tong Wars, and it just is almost... It's fictionalized, but not in a way that's grounded necessarily in the research or the cultural understanding. In terms of my methodological approach, I think for the purposes of that question, those two large collections of letters that I found, okay, so one is from the period 1880s to 1920s, the other is 1930s to 1950s. That second one had 250 letters. When I found these, I was teaching in Shanghai, China, spending my summers here in Montana. And so I was very excited. I thought, hey, I said, has anybody translated these before? They said the one thing about the guy with the 3 letters. And they said, but we just don't know anybody who reads Chinese. And I'm teaching in Shanghai, a city, small little town of 25 million, I thought, I know a few people who read Chinese. And so I digitized this was in 2010, and digitized these and sent them to my Mandarin speaking and Mandarin teaching colleagues and thought, we're going to tell this story just like that. They could read about 30% of the letters from the 1880s. A couple of different reasons why. They're written in a difficult-to-read calligraphy. Most importantly, though, they're written in the traditional form of Chinese writing script. It was simplified in the 1940s and 50s by the Communist Party to try and spread literacy. That worked, but it also divorced 1.4 billion Chinese people from being able to read my Montana letters from 1880s. right? And so I had to get creative. I didn't want to give up here. And so thankfully at the school that I was working at in Shanghai, it was a wonderfully diverse multinational population. And I had some families from Taiwan and some families from Hong Kong who could read the traditional script. And you got to kind of know your Chinese politics to understand why that is the case. But I had my Taiwanese families, my Hong Kong families, and grandmothers and grandfathers who had learned traditional script. And so I wrote a series of grants to bring a research team here to Helena, Montana, while we had an intergenerational translation team working in Shanghai. So in Helena, we're digitizing the documents, sending them back and forth. Did that twice, 2012 for the first collection of letters, and then 2014 for the Cold War collection of letters. Each had two translation teams independently translate each letter, so that we could then corroborate and set them next to each other and come up with the best translation. But that was a long process, and it took support from my school, it took creativity, it took support from the Montana Historical Society. It also took just being in the right place at the right time, finding these and having the families with the knowledge to help unlock these stories.
Okay, can I?
Sure.
I have a question for you on all this, because I'm still impressed that you found letters. I'm guessing that you relied on them for your book, but do you intend to publish like a translation of these letters, or?
Actually published May 1st, 2022 through the University of Nebraska Press. So chapter 2 is all about those 1880s to 1920s letters. Chapter 8 is about the 1930s to 1950s letters. Those ones are interesting. The gentleman working in Butte got into America in 1933 at the age of 14, but he was detained at the immigration station up in Seattle for 6 weeks to test and corroborate who he said he was. He claimed American citizenship, but they asked him hundreds and hundreds of questions to the level of detail of how many steps is it from the front door of your house to the pond. And then they would take those answers and corroborate them against his grandfather who had immigrated 22 years earlier, and set those questions next to each other and say, is he a paper son? Is he who he says he is? Or should we deny him? So he's detained for 6 weeks, eventually let in, works in Butte as a laundry worker. In Butte, you know, richest hill on earth, copper mining. Obviously, you think, well, Chinese in the West work in mining. They must have worked in the mines in Butte. They were systematically excluded from working in Butte's underground mines. This gentleman is the first person of Chinese ethnicity to work in Butte's underground mines. He gets a job in the Mountain Con mine in 1940. Why might that be the case? Wartime needs, copper is increasingly needed, plus manpower shortages with the draft becoming the peacetime draft. We hadn't yet gone to war, and so white workers are going off, and they begin to possibly relax tensions on who they would allow to work in these underground mines. And the claim always is against the Chinese in the West. We won't let them be citizens because they reject citizenship. They reject assimilation. They don't take on our ways. This guy took on American ways. I've got pictures of him hunting antelope, mule deer. He joins the labor union in the Mountain Con mine. Is there something more Butte America to do than join the miners' union? Right? We've got pictures of him celebrating Christmas. We've got pictures of him with his brand new Chrysler car that he's so proud of. But his brother, who should have the same exact rationale to be allowed into the United States, is stuck in Hong Kong. And so the brother in Butte is desperately trying to get his brother from southern China out of war-torn southern China. Why war-torn? Because the communists versus the nationalists, the Chinese Civil War, it happened in the 30s, only interrupted by the Japanese invasion, and then the Chinese Civil War resumed. And so that area of China is absolutely war-torn, and our guy in Butte is desperately trying to get his brother out. And that's what those 250 letters attest to. Jumping through every hoop that the U.S. consulate puts in front of them, validating who he is, and they even enlist the support of Senator Mike Mansfield to try and grease the wheels a little bit. And so that goes on from 1948 through 1958, the brother in Butte trying to get his brother out safely and to rejoin him here in Montana. That's chapter 8 of the book.
Thanks for that, Mark. And so the final question I wanted to ask before we get to the audience portion of this, and hopefully we'll have time to field a good amount of questions, so get those questions ready. The last question I wanted to ask is pointing out that obviously the Chinese experience historically in Montana didn't happen in a vacuum. And so it's not like all these events happened and then in the 1920s we get to low Chinese populations and then we get to the Montana we have today, which is predominantly white. So what I want to point to here is how the racial violence inherent to the Chinese experience historically manifests into the present. I know the media over the last few years has reported a rise in anti-Asian violence. And in Montana, in the 2020 Senate race, both Democrats and Republicans were taking their fair share of hits against China, scapegoating it for a variety of China's problems. In Missoula recently, just last week, we had the Democratic congressional candidate Monica Trinnell say that China was to blame for Montana's fentanyl problem today, which there isn't a lot of material evidence to support a claim like that. So I'm a little curious here, since bashing China is something that's so mainstreamed on both sides of the aisle. You'll get liberals, conservatives, and they're both quite comfortable with speaking, animus against China. I'm just a little curious how your writing draws on the historical Chinese experience to better understand the reality that Asians face in Montana and across the United States.
I'm more into the dusty archives of the past than weighing in on current politics, to be honest with you. But even at the time period, it was bandied about. So if you were a politician, for instance, there were politicians in Fort Benton who employed a Chinese cook, and that was used against them in political campaigns. Wilbur Fisk Sanders stood up for the Chinese in 1896 and fought against them in this boycott. He's one of Montana's founding fathers, one of the original vigilantes. He took up the Chinese case in 1896 and fought for them in court. In 1893, he said, "I hope that they will be diminished to extinction in Montana." Was he lying? No, I think he was a politician and knew his different audiences, right? And so it's always been politically dangerous to stand up for the Chinese in Montana. The thing that I found most interesting, in 1905, there was an effort for the Chinese to stand up for themselves that impacted Montana's economics. So there's an overall global boycott by Chinese consumers of American goods in 1905. They had fought against the Chinese Exclusion Act in the Supreme Court and lost. They had fought against it, saying this is morally wrong, and lost. So they said, let's fight against what Americans really care about, money. Let's stop buying American goods. Now, can a Chinese guy working in Fort Benton stop buying American goods? No. But they absolutely took up cause for this. And really what happened is Montana wheat growers that had a bumper crop in 1905 were so afraid that they would lose access to the Chinese market that they actually advocated with the Roosevelt government, Teddy Roosevelt's government, saying, please, can you lessen the animosity against the Chinese? What the Chinese were really hoping for is an eradication of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That didn't happen. But growers like Montana wheat farmers that wanted their wheat consumed by the Chinese market got in Teddy Roosevelt's ear and said, we need to lessen the animus against the Chinese. It worked. Teddy Roosevelt eliminated a number of different restrictions against the Chinese in 1905, transferred the most virulent immigration agents away from ports and borders that dealt with Chinese migrants. So you had this weird coming together of wheat farmers outside of my hometown of Great Falls, impacted by a global anti-American boycott by the Chinese globally, impacting American politics. So kind of a coming together in the past that lets me kind of sidestep Paul's question from the present.
Well, I mean, a lot of my work also deals with the past. But for example, Islanders came out in July 2016, so it was published as a book of history, and it curiously became a book of current affairs as that year went on. But I think to understand what's anti-Asian violence today, and especially that was especially bad in the last 2 or 3 years, especially with the pandemic, is you do have to go back into the history. I think without understanding the historical context, it probably would seem like pretty random. So I think that's a pretty crucial part of it. And again, like I said, I feel that because of this whole historical context that we've been talking about, Chinese have been stereotyped into positions where, like I said, they become like convenient specters to invoke, when there's time of cataclysmic change, which, COVID was a time of cataclysmic change. people had no idea what was going on. People had no idea. I mean, especially if you think back to like March 2020, as much as you want to forget that time, we had no idea what this virus is. We had no idea. Like, we see people dying, but we don't know how to treat it. We don't know, is it going to infect, like, is it this, is the infection rate like, you touch the person and you're like, okay, I'm going to die, that kind of thing. And there was so much uncertainty about the virus, about the economy because of all the shutdowns. And so when people are uncertain, they try to cling onto something. And we did have a president at that time who, started calling it the China virus. And so people started to cling onto that. And but the stereotypes have been already there, that when the former president, who I will not name, said China virus, people are like, yeah.
Well, thanks for that. And that concludes the prepared questions that I have. So if anyone is just dying to get a question out, this really is your time. So yeah, we could take a question here and you could speak it to me and then I'll try and repeat it for the folks watching on camera.
I'm wondering for Teow, this is more of a writer question, but you write both poetry and essay. How do you know what is a poem and what is an essay?
So the question was for Teow, and it was a question as a writer, when you're writing in a poem or an essay, how do you know between each form and make that decision on how you're going to pursue a question?
A very short version answer is, if you think about what essay is, essay comes from the French word to try. So usually, and I won't say it's 100%, but it's pretty close. If I'm trying to explore the dimensions of a subject, like, I have no idea, like, I think this is interesting, I have no idea what's going on, I start with an essay, and using that essay to figure out, like, not just what I think of it, but even just what the facts are. And usually, by the time I get to poetry, I have already done that work, and if I feel like there is a deeper, there's something else that I want to explore in the material, and especially if it's something that it's hard to depict with, like, the rationality of prose, and that's when I try poetry.
So, for Mark, you mentioned the importance of the money flowing back to Southern China, and I suppose that was the 1890s part. Sure. So how do we spend money?
The question was about money being sent from Montana to southern China, and the questioner wanted to know specifically how the money was sent.
The same way they got the abalone.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There was a surprisingly frequent back and forth. Steamships going once a month, even during the exclusion era after 1882, steamships going back and forth constantly. So in terms of, I'm sorry? So good question. Is it cash money? And this question comes up a lot. There were basically three ways to turn your earnings here into things that could be remitted, sent back. So you could send cash with a returning family member or friend, right? That was the most reliable way to do it, but also the most infrequent. When are you going to have a friend going back? But they could theoretically go to your village and give it to your mother. In the 1880s letters, we don't know where his father is. We do have letters from his mother testifying to how important it was that this money is coming back. So that was the most infrequent but most trustworthy. The second way, you could hire a courier that was specifically to take that money to that village. That was a 5% fee, sometimes higher, so a little bit steep, but also pretty trustworthy there too. The third and definitely most common way was to hire what's called a Gold Mountain firm. And these would be the Chinese mercantiles. So there would have been one here in Missoula. The one in Butte was the Wachong Tai Mercantile, run by merchants. They would be importing abalone. They'd be importing other goods that Chinese workers here wanted. And they would pool workers' funds and transfer that into a good that they knew was needed in Hong Kong, depending on their knowledge of the markets. So they'd pool those workers' funds, buy something that could be sold for a profit in Hong Kong, and then parse out the money to different families. And so they're making a profit on top of that. It's not, I mean, they're in it to make money. That was for a 2% fee. So much more common, more reasonable to do that. But that fascinating, they're not just sending those dollar bills back, they're transferring it based on what they know of the economies in the local areas to try and maximize their profit but still get those monies to the families. And we don't have the letters from our guy in Butte writing to Southern China because by definition they're in Southern China. But the letters that we do have from Butte, housed in Helena now, testify to how frequently he's sending money, how much money he sent. His family members back in in Southern China were convinced that he was rich. They said, "We know your hands are bathed in gold. Your hands are bathed in gold." He was a laundry worker. His hands are bathed in steam burns, right? And we actually have records that he was going into deep debt in Butte to send as much as he could back home. And that the request for more money never stopped. It was never enough.
Take another question. Yeah.
So you published a book that references the letters. Are you going to make the letters, the translations of the letters themselves publicly available anywhere?
The question was, is Mark going to make the published letters available for the public?
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about it. I've got a website, bigskychinese.com, where I sell the book, and then I also look at other ongoing projects. For instance, we've got a cemetery project that's pretty interesting that we can talk about in a little bit, but it might be a good idea to have a page on there that just features those letters. Pretty exciting events. This has been a great week. Here in Missoula today, I was in Clancy, Montana on Thursday. I was in New York virtually on Wednesday, talking with the Museum of the Chinese in America. And the president of that museum is now, I'm going to go out to New York, and she has connections with actors and actresses through her drama background. She's going to have actors do dramatic rereadings of the letters on November 8th. And so I think that's I hadn't even thought about that as a creative possibility. But in terms of just making the letters publicly available, I think bigskychinese.com would probably be the way to go.
Or there might be a press that might be interested, especially a university press or something. Because, I mean, that's a find. I mean, that is.
I really appreciate how surprised you are at this. The attempt to tell the story of the Chinese in the American West has been frustrated at every turn because of a lack of sources. And stumble across the sources, do hard work to try and translate them, and now you can appreciate it.
I mean, there's a really big project at Stanford University, and they couldn't find letters.
Yeah, they came out with a couple of books about the railroad workers, and they note throughout those books that the one thing missing from their project is the voice of the Chinese themselves.
Max.
So I have a question for Teow. You mentioned that something that you're trying to do with, especially your poetry collection, I think, is to fill in those gaps in the archive, I think is how you put it. So I studied history, and I'm thinking about a couple of things I've read. Venus in Two Acts by Sadia Hartman and Ties to Bind by Ty Miles, which both are kind of like that, where they're approaching this problem of these experiences of people who we know they existed. We have some scant records. I think Venus in Two Acts is about the life of a woman who died after being kidnapped and en route on a slave ship to the United States, and Ties to Bind is about an Afro-Cherokee family, a mixed-race family in the 1800s, and both of them are sort of doing the similar thing of taking these sort of established facts and then this active, I guess, informed speculation about the specifics and nuances and not just where they went and who they knew, but their desires and their thoughts and their feelings, and they sort of are upfront about this, and they talk about trying to sort of undo the violence of the archive, right? Because what is preserved in the archive of history is, as you sort of talked about, very sort of, it's not a coincidence, right? It preserves powerful voices, right? White people, men, wealthy people, and so I guess to formulate a question here, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about how you think about your work of sort of mollifying violence of the archive, to borrow a phrase, and why you think it might be important.
I hope the camera was able to pick that up because that's really well said. But to summarize briefly, the question was to Teow, and it was about using poetry to fill the gaps between what we know about people in the past whose lives are not particularly well preserved, and how poetry can overcome the quote-unquote violence of the archives.
Again, I have a whole essay on this. Yeah, so the answer is buy the book. Okay, I'll just read a bit from the book. So I say that the documents contain evidence, but the deeper story lies in the lives of the people who haunt these official reports, the intimate terrain beneath the facts. And the archives tell the story from a white perspective and slanted towards the interests of the railroad managers and territorial government. It is the story told by those in power to deflect their culpability in this atrocity. And then I go on to say there are no known records left by the men who work in the mines in the Old West, but apparently there is. But I feel that, at least on the poetry side of my work, a lot of it is centering the Chinese experience. And I will say the Chinese experience is certainly not the only experience of the American West. You know, there are plenty of other interesting stories. I'm told yesterday there was a panel about the Black experience, which I unfortunately couldn't attend, but I told that was really interesting. You know, there's also the Hispanic experience. So the Chinese experience isn't the only thing that matters, but for me I wanted to shift the focus from, you know, the white perspective to like what happens if you look at this from a Chinese perspective. And for me I'm not even going to apologize for that. It's like I'm just going to claim the space and just do it.
I think we have time for, well, there are two hands up, so we'll take both your questions, and then we'll call it quits after that. So
my question is, how much curiosity do you guys know about from China about the experience of people here? There's interest here in this room about what the experience is, but like, how much is there from the other side?
So the question was, there's clearly a lot of experience or interest here in the Chinese experience in Montana, but if you flip that, what does it look like in terms of interest from China to the history in Montana?
You know, when I was teaching and doing my classes through this lens, the students and their families were very interested. Nationally speaking, I don't know if Chinese culture and the present looks at this as important history. It's so recent, and it also deals with the lives of ordinary people. I think for a culture that is so long and proud, I think their history that they like to look back on is Song Dynasty history, whereas this feels like yesterday. And dealing with people who normally don't rise to the level of important historical study. Well, I will say when I mentioned to Chinese folks this, so I mentioned that that militia that was training in Butte, they were part of something called the Chinese Empire Reform Association. Dowager Empress had been in control. She retires. The Guangxu Emperor takes hold, tries to westernize. Dowager Empress doesn't like that. She comes back into power, arrests the Guangxu Emperor, puts him in house arrest until his death in 1909, about 10 years later. And she, or her minions, capture and execute as many of the reformers as they can. They miss two, a guy named Kang Youwei and another guy named Liang Qichao, two of the most brilliant Confucian scholars in all of Chinese history. They escape and live in exile and start this group called the Chinese Empire Reform Association. Travel around the world, trying to raise money to try and get the rightful emperor back on the throne. My assertion is there's branches in Australia, Japan, Singapore, Burma, Canada, Mexico. My assertion is Montana had the greatest critical mass of branches of this organization with 12. And when I tell that to people, when they hear Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, the Chinese people, they think, wow, those guys, they went to Montana? Yeah, they went to Livingston, they went to Fort Benton, they came here to Missoula and Billings and Bozeman. And so when it gets to that level of kind of dynastic politics, that catches their interest.
So one of my great uncles, he lives in, so my grandma's family, they grew up in China, but they fled during the Communist Revolution. My grandma and her sister went to Singapore. The rest of them, most of them, eventually ended up in the U.S. So this uncle, he's based in Honolulu, and he was asking me, like, so what you working on now? And I told him about the Rock Springs Massacre project, and he's like, wow, it's so good that someone like you are remembering these stories, because the people in China don't remember the stories of, they don't want to remember the stories of the people who left. And again, I think at an individual level, there might be some interest, but the sense I get is that on a cultural level, it's almost like they're left, they're kind of dead to us.
And in fact, for a long time period, to emigrate, to leave China, you couldn't return. It was supposedly upon penalty of death. That was rarely enforced. But it was that if you expatriated, if you left your country, you left the Middle Kingdom, you left you were disloyal. So I think that's an interesting point.
Thanks for that. And as we wrap up this panel, we're going to take one more question, and then everyone can have some mingle time or whatnot. But we'll take this last question in the back here.
Public history. So I just moved to Montana 2 months ago. I came from the South. Thank you. So I'm learning about all of this history here, and a lot of, in my head, I think Deadwood, which I know is not Montana, but still there are Chinese characters in Deadwood, and we went to Virginia City and Nevada City, and the Chinese presence is not absent, but it's not prevalent. The reenactors are doing the assayer and the dry goods store and things like that, and there's a Chinese laundry, but it's really neglected. And where I come from in the South, some of the plantations, for example, are shifting over to tell the entire story of the plantation from the enslaved perspective. And I wonder if you see any kind of movement like that to make the history more public and more accessible to more people here.
So the question was, when Montana narrates its own history in places like Virginia City, it seems like there's an omission of the Chinese perspective, and that is in comparison to places like plantations, which have a lot of them in the South have moved towards telling the perspectives of enslaved people. So what is Montana doing to tell those perspectives?
I'm going to ask you to keep the mic. Tell us about Missoula.
Yeah.
Tours here that might be of interest.
So there are some people working on these questions in Missoula, and I'm one of them. And I was doing some work finishing my undergrad last year, and I found out that there was not only a Chinese cemetery in Missoula, but there's a long history of white people in Missoula interacting with the Chinese community here. You get stories, and Mark found a great picture, which is published in his book, so yet another reason to get it, of Chinese people having parades down the streets of Missoula, and you see crowds and crowds of white people. And the reason that white people were joining is, they'd start these parades over there and then walk down that way towards the cemetery, which is just at the base of Mount Jumbo, which you can honestly just see right over there. And they'd make a lot of noise and set off firecrackers, and as these were going down, you would have white people join in throngs, kind of like to point and hoot and holler, but because they were somewhat interested in the spectacle. And so that's some history that's been unearthed recently in Missoula that didn't get a lot of attention prior. But recently in the archives this summer, I was able to locate, with the help of a professor in town, the exact location and a picture, actually, of the Chinese cemetery. And the picture is taken right on top of Waterworks Hill, and it's looking that way, and you could see the cemetery in the distance. So it's our hope that in the future, and I say it's our hope as like the royal arts, really just me, but it's my hope that in the future we could figure out ways to memorialize this. And I think this book festival is a good first step because, as a community, lots of different people are coming to talk about this history and think about what it means that Missoula is built on a lot of Chinese history that's been buried. And you have institutions in town like Cranky Sam's, which is obviously named after an eclectic Chinese figure in town. But the way his history is narrated in that establishment is from the perspective of the newspaper clippings we have of him, which say that he was, this vagabond who often broke the law, and eventually he died, and, maybe he was even placed in the Chinese cemetery. So Mark and I were talking about this a bit earlier, and we really don't know what's over there at Poplar and Cherry Street. Today there are a bunch of houses. If they try and build basements, they run into a lot of bones. And there are lots of places in Missoula that are like that. So we're hoping in the future And this event is sort of a nice first step to that. But as a community, we could be in conversation about the ways that we want to remember that sort of history. And welcome to Missoula, by the way.
For the public history telling of things, very, very little remains from the Chinatowns of Montana. Helena's Chinatown was, at one point in time, Helena was 21% Chinese. And now there's one building left that has a connection to Helena's historic Chinatown because of urban renewal in the 1950s and 60s. The place where you can see this most prominently in its remnants is Butte. So I'd highly recommend a visit to Butte. The Meiwa Society, the Meiwa Museum is still open for a couple of weeks. Also, there's a film that's recently come out by the Extreme History Project out of Bozeman called The Story of Us, and it focuses on 4 Montana women. One of those is Rose Hum Lee, a woman who was born in Butte in 1903. She went on to become the first woman and first Asian American to chair a major university department. And so she's a very important Chinese Montanan and has a very interesting story. And so that film will be shown around the state, The Story of Us again. And then through public history, Paul and my interests overlap in terms of cemeteries. Sadly, there's not much left here above ground, but there are 4 cemeteries throughout Montana that still have Chinese headstones. And I've got a grant run through the Montana History Foundation that is funding the translation of these headstones, 40 headstones, some in Helena, some in Butte, some in Bozeman, some in Billings, to try and translate the individuals' names and the home village where they were from, to move the translation into spoken Taishanese, because that's the language that the migrants would have spoken, to try and then identify who is commemorated at that site in the non-Chinese sources, in the English sources, immigration records. Ideally, optimistically, we also have a partner who will work on the ground in Taishan County to try and find if the bones were exhumed and returned, which was in keeping with Chinese cultural traditions. If they were exhumed here in Montana and returned for reburial in Taishan, we might be able to find the reburied commemorating area and maybe connect with extended family members. So fingers crossed, but it's an exciting project that is ongoing.
There are Chinese burials in Yellowstone and still
Good. So when you do projects like this, you learn more about where they were. Obviously, they were buried all across the state. Usually, their burial location was noted with a wooden headboard with painting on it because they weren't intended to remain. Their remains weren't intended to stay here in perpetuity. So why would you need a stone marker? And so when the remains were exhumed and returned, then those cemetery sites have been lost to us. Sometimes a different form of marker was used, mostly in California or Nevada, where a burial brick, a red brick with the name of the person painted on it and the village painted on it, so that when bone collectors came around, they would see that, exhume the remains, and send them back. Only one known burial brick has ever been found in Montana. It was found in 1937 when road construction was happening right over here. It commemorated a guy named Li Fu Lim. His remains weren't there, the brick was, so he was probably successfully exhumed and returned for reburial where he can be acknowledged by his descendants back in southern China.
And before we conclude here, I actually wrote down an excerpt from the Helena Independent Record, which is a newspaper that still runs today, obviously. And it's from June 7th, 1884. And I think it speaks to the sort of Chinese legacies that built Montana that we're not always aware of. And so the excerpt, which was published on the front page of the Helena IR on June 7th, 1884, reads, "There are probably 1,000 Chinese buried who worked for the railroad company between Spokane and Helena. They were buried in shallow graves, and in various places the coffins are visible. Verily, the road was built with Chinamen's bones." So there is no highway, there is no railroad you could really travel on in this state without going over the dead bodies of the people who died in order to construct them. So on that very cheery note, I hope we could applaud for Teow and Mark and thank them for bringing our time.